Hello everyone, this is Mrs. Brown here tonight. Today's presentation is about the technique of irony used in literature. And the objective of this presentation is for you to be able to define what irony is and to recognize examples of some of the different types of irony. There are actually many different kinds of definitions for irony, but the one that I think will be most applicable for our class is that irony is a literary technique when the author creates a difference between the perceived meaning and the actual meaning of the words or the events. There are three main types of irony that you will find in different types of literature. The first is verbal irony, the second, situational irony, and finally, dramatic irony. Now, verbal irony also takes three forms of itself. The first is sarcasm, when you say the opposite of what you actually mean. The next is understatement, where you say something is really less than it actually is. And overstatement, which is saying that something is much more important than it really is. And we'll show you some examples of each one of those types. The first type of verbal irony is understatement. Now, in Romeo and Juliet, you may remember there's this moment where Mercutio is fatally stabbed, and he's lying there bleeding to death from this wound, but he's covering it up, and he's saying sarcastically, "No, 'tis not so deep as a well, no so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough, 'twill serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man." Mercutio is basically saying that it's not that big a deal. You know, it's not as deep as a well, and it's not as wide as a church door, but this wound that I have is going to be enough to kill me. That would be an example of understatement. Another type of sarcasm in verbal irony is overstatement, and this is where you mock something by making it appear to be bigger or more important than it actually is. Maybe you're familiar with this meme with the Willy Wonka character leaning in, but it's sort of making fun of something and saying, "Oh, you just graduated, you must know everything," where you kind of hold something up to ridicule by making it appear to be more than your intent is that you actually believe it is. So we just looked at some examples of verbal irony. Now let's talk about situational irony. Situational irony is when what happens is the opposite of what was expected, or a situation in which the actions have an effect that's opposite from what was intended or what was expected or what was anticipated. Situational irony often involves some sort of reversal of these expectations. We're going to take a look at some pictures that are pretty good definitions of situational irony. The first picture is this tattoo that says, "When writing the story of your life, don't let anyone else hold the pen." Of course, the irony is, how did anyone possibly tattoo this on her? And we can see just how well this product, Rust-Oleum, that claims to stop rust, is doing. And of course, finally, we have the postponement of the people who are most famous for postponing things. And I think if my students attended Lakewood High School, we certainly would need some literacy meetings, whether they started at 6:30 or at some other point in time. Does everyone catch this? Leaping to literacy. Now, there are many books and plays and even short stories and poems that make great use of situational irony in literature. Some of you may have read the story Fahrenheit 451, which is set in the future at a time when books are banned. In that story, firemen don't put out fires. The firemen are the ones who start fires. The firemen are called in to burn any books that they find. Or maybe you remember from Life of Pi, where Pi is about to die of thirst and dehydration, even though he's completely surrounded by water. The idea of dying of thirst while being surrounded by water, although the water is nothing that you can drink because of the salt water. Or Romeo tries to keep the peace by keeping Mercutio and Tybalt from fighting, and instead leads to an even bigger fight that causes the death of his best friend and his own banishment from Verona. Or maybe last year you read, in your middle school years, you read The Gift of the Magi, which is O. Henry's story where this young couple who's very much in love work really, really hard to buy each other Christmas presents. And the guy buys for the girl a set of hair combs or barrettes for her hair, but in order to get the money for it, he sells his famous pocket watch. And when he opens up his gift from her on Christmas morning, it's a chain for the pocket watch, and she has paid for it by cutting her hair and selling her hair to make the money. So it's a famous example of situational irony in literature. Now, the final type of irony is known as dramatic irony, and this is when the reader or the audience knows something that the characters do not yet know, and that anticipation of when the character is going to learn the truth and when they're going to discover the reality of the scene or the situation often creates foreshadowing and suspense and makes it very exciting to read or to watch. Some examples of dramatic irony in literature include that moment when the audience knows that Juliet is not really dead, that she's about to wake up any second now, but we still watch Romeo go through committing suicide. Or where we know perfectly well that Oedipus, who stands up on the steps and says, I will catch the killer of Laius, is indeed the killer of Laius. Some of you may know The Lion King, where Simba spends most of the film convinced that it's himself who's responsible for his father's death, but we really know as the audience that it's Scar who caused all of these problems. Most horror stories depend on dramatic irony, where we as the audience member know that the killer is hiding in the attic or behind the door or down those stairs, but the heroine doesn't and just continues on her merry way until they run into each other. And that's dramatic irony, when the audience knows something that the character does not yet know. A form of irony that's related, although it doesn't fit quite the technical definition, is parody and satire. Now, parody and satire are related to irony, but they're often concerned with mocking the form of a genre. They copy that style in order to draw attention to the more ridiculous elements of it. Now, sometimes parody or satire can be a very short piece, or it may be an entire long work. And the key is that, again, that it keeps the form of the original. Some examples include most of the sketches that you might see on Saturday Night Live. If you've ever read Mad Magazine, that's an entire parody. George Orwell's Animal Farm is a satire. Or Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is a satire of these kinds of noble quest stories with the King Arthur's court. Or even The Colbert Report, if you've ever seen that on television, where Stephen Colbert is a comedian who has set up a parody of the types of Bill O'Reilly's show that appear on talk networks and are about politics. Usually when I teach about irony, at least some student will ask me about the Alanis Morissette song called Isn't It Ironic? And the ironic thing about Alanis Morissette's song is that even though it claims to be ironic, very few of the actual examples in there are definitions of irony. She claims a black fly in your Chardonnay or a traffic jam when you're already late. These are unfortunate incidents, but they do not rise to the definition of irony. So sorry, Alanis, but it actually is not ironic. So in conclusion, many authors will use irony as a way to highlight the flaws in their characters or to point out something that's ridiculous or needs to be changed in society at large. So make sure that you're looking for these three types of literature, three types of irony in the literature that we read and really in the culture that's all around you. And that's it. Bye-bye now.